So I used to give these examples of what makes the Qur'an awesome and what makes it beautiful and things like that. And my students loved it and they said, why don't you just teach a class of just the examples? No Arabic. So they said that enough times and I compiled enough examples that I said, might as well turn it into a program. Might as well turn it into a course. This is where this course kind of came from, those examples. The other thing is, when we study the Qur'an nowadays, we study it, subhanAllah, we study it from the angle of tajweed. We study the Qur'an from the angle of tafsir. We study the Qur'an from the angle of ulum al-Qur'an. There are different angles from which we study the Qur'an. But one of the angles that's missing, that's actually really important, is we don't study the Qur'an as much just as literature. The Qur'an just as literature. People study Shakespeare as literature. People study novels, read novels as literature. But people don't think of the Qur'an as literature. The moment they think of the Qur'an, they start thinking of some complex discussions and religious discussions and philosophical discussions and academic discussions. But when you do all of those things, you lose sight of the fact that it's something beautiful, that it's beautiful literature. And so the intention behind this program also is to reintroduce the Qur'an to us, not as something to study the tafsir of necessarily, not even to go through the ulum al-Qur'an side of it, even though those things will come up, but rather to look at the Qur'an as literature. That's what we're going to do, a literary analysis of the Qur'an. And I personally believe, because of my experience in the United States, I personally believe this is very important for our times. Here's why. If we do enough work on the Qur'an as literature, then we can produce entire bodies of work focusing on this area. And when we do, then the Qur'an will not only be taught in the religious studies departments in universities all over the world. The Qur'an can then also be taught in the literature department. The Qur'an can also be taught where? In the literature department, the world literature department. And when it is taught in the world literature department, you see it's different. When the non-Muslims, they study the Qur'an in the religious programs, in the religious studies programs, they study it to criticize it, to attack it, to deconstruct it, to tell you the mistakes in it and all this other stuff. They only come at it to criticize it. But when you study something in the literature department, you're not studying it to criticize it, you're studying it to appreciate it. So in other words, we can create an opportunity to study, the world can study the Qur'an in a way that is not confrontational. It's actually out of curiosity. It changes the conversation about Allah's book entirely. So there's that opportunity as well. Okay, so let's begin, bi'idhnillah ta'ala. The first thing I want to talk to you about today, this introduction session, is going to be the longest one. This introduction is 2 parts. This is the long introduction, it's 2 parts. A brief introduction, a literary introduction to the Qur'an, and a brief introduction to Arabic. We need both. A little bit of an introduction to the Qur'an and a little bit of an introduction to